Welcome to Revenge Report. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more. Let's dive in. The moment I stepped out of the car, I regretted wearing the black dress. Not because it didn't fit. On the contrary, it hugged just right and blended perfectly. But it made me feel like I was walking into a funeral, not a wedding. My name is Olivia Baines. I'm 37 years old. I live in Bethesda, Maryland. And I wasn't here to celebrate. I was here because I had a gut feeling that something wasn't right. That, and a file that landed on my desk 3 weeks ago with my sister's fiancé's name on it. Not exactly the kind of wedding gift one expects from a former military intelligence officer. The venue was ridiculous. All glass and marble, overlooking a lake that shimmered like it had been photoshopped into existence. My sister Vanessa never did anything without sparkle and spectacle. She loved being the center of attention, and this day was no different. I slipped in quietly through the side entrance, avoiding the photographers and socialite aunts who would demand answers about where I'd been for the past 5 years. The dress helped. I looked like I belonged in the catering staff, not among the high-profile guests mingling over champagne. The ceremony was about to begin. Rows of white chairs filled with well-dressed people who all seemed like they were in on a secret I wasn't invited to. I chose a seat near the back, away from the family pew. Vanessa wouldn't notice. I was never part of the stage show anyway. Then I heard it. Two men chatting behind a hedge wall, one of them laughing softly. Russian, not just Russian. Rostov dialect. My spine straightened. I hadn't heard that particular accent since a sting-op in Tashkent 7 years ago. And it wasn't the kind of dialect you picked up casually at college. I reached up and brushed my hair behind my ear, pressing a fingertip against the flesh just inside. A click. The earpiece activated instantly. Perseus, I said softly. That one word did what 100 pages of paperwork couldn't. It triggered a full-scale interagency response. I'd only used it once before, in Ankara, and it nearly started an international incident. The groom walked down the aisle, arms stiff at his sides, his smile stretched too wide. Mikhail Vasilyev, also known as Male to his American friends, was dressed in tailored white, but his eyes kept scanning the crowd, for threats or for backup. Vanessa came next, radiant and beaming, eating up every camera flash like sunlight. She looked beautiful, I'll give her that. But all I could see was a pawn in a very dangerous game. Team 1, confirm eyes on target, a voice whispered in my ear. I recognized it. Agent Clive, Homeland Security. Affirmative, I murmured. Proceed with phase 2 on my mark. The ceremony went on. Vows, tears, laughter. It was all a polished lie. Every detail orchestrated to make sure no one asked too many questions about the groom, his father, or the men seated quietly in the third row with matching cufflinks and identical watches. When they kissed, the crowd erupted in applause. I gave the signal. Helicopters didn't arrive with roaring chaos. They came low, fast, and silent, circling like hawks above a rabbit. Guests began to murmur. Then the front entrance burst open. FBI, Interpol, Homeland Security. Men in suits and earpieces swarmed the venue like ants on sugar. Someone screamed. Glass broke. I didn't flinch. I stayed seated until I saw them haul Mikhail's father out in cuffs. Then Mikhail himself, hands raised but defiant, was marched down the aisle like a lamb dressed in Gucci. The two men from the hedge, taken as well. One of them tried to bolt, didn't get far. Vanessa's eyes searched the crowd, wide and frantic, until they landed on me. I stood slowly. You? She mouthed. I didn't nod. I didn't smile. I just turned and walked out, the way I had come in, quiet, unnoticed, and wearing black. Summary: Olivia Baines attends her sister Vanessa's wedding not to celebrate, but to investigate. When she overhears a Russian conversation that triggers her past training, she sets in motion a covert operation. Before the cake is cut, the groom, his father, and 2 associates are arrested, turning a dream wedding into a federal takedown. Olivia doesn't flinch. She came prepared. The envelope arrived on a Wednesday. Thick cardstock, cream-colored, sealed with rose gold wax and a tiny pressed V in the center. My sister always did like drama. Inside was a folded invitation printed in cursive, so ornate I had to tilt it toward the light to read it. I recognized Vanessa's signature touch in every over-designed detail. The absurd location, the italicized, black tie formal dress code, even the venue's GPS coordinates stamped on the bottom like it was some sort of covert military operation. Tucked inside, separate from the card, was a smaller handwritten note. Not from Vanessa, from Mom. Please try to come, sweetheart. it would mean a lot to your sister. And to me. No one in my family ever said please unless they were about to make you feel guilty for not complying. I didn't respond right away. I placed the card on my desk and stared at it for 2 full days. Then I packed the dress. Black, matte, floor length. No sequins, no frills, no room for misinterpretation. Alongside it, I packed a small metal case with an old earpiece from my last rotation overseas. It had sat unused in a drawer for years, just in case. I wasn't even sure if it still worked. But I didn't trust this thing, this wedding, or the man standing next to my sister in the engagement photo she posted online last month. He looked right into the camera like he was daring someone to challenge him. I arrived at the rehearsal dinner late, on purpose. By the time I walked in, half the room was already on their second glass of Prosecco, and Vanessa was mid-toast, surrounded by glowing candles and more white hydrangeas than any fire code should allow. She saw me before I made it 3 steps into the ballroom. "Oh, look," she said, her voice lilting with that polished, performative sweetness she used for public occasions. "The elusive Olivia graces us with her presence. Are we wearing black now? Are we in mourning?" Polite laughter followed from her friends. I offered a thin smile and said nothing. Vanessa's fiancé, Mikhail Vasilyev, though everyone now called him male for some unfathomable reason, raised his champagne flute at me and nodded like we were old friends. I didn't nod back. The dinner stretched into the kind of evening I hated. Long-winded toasts, fawning friends, filtered photos, and the empty ritual of upper-class celebration. I sat at the far end of the table, drinking sparkling water from a heavy crystal glass, while my family skillfully excluded me with their eyes and their body language. Vanessa talked loudly about the ceremony details, the string quartet, the imported linen napkins. "And Mikhail's father, he's handling all the logistics for the honeymoon," she said, beaming like a pageant queen. "He's done business all over Europe. Such an incredible mind for detail." I tilted my head. Business all over Europe, logistics, vague phrasing paired with expensive suits and offshore-sounding surnames. I'd heard that song before. My glass met the table a little harder than intended. Later, when Vanessa brushed past me on her way to the dessert table, she paused just long enough to drop a whisper into my ear. "Try not to scare anyone tonight, Lieutenant Baines. We're trying to keep the tone celebratory." I didn't flinch. Just watched her walk away in a cloud of perfume and pretense. I wasn't here for cake. I was here because something was wrong. And I always knew when something was wrong. The house was already humming by the time I made it down to the breakfast room. It was one of those old Georgian estates, all white molding and marble, the kind of place that looked like it belonged in a magazine spread called Old Money Traditions. Of course, it didn't belong to my parents. They were borrowing it for the weekend from one of Vanessa's friends from DC, a senator's daughter, or maybe some hedge fund heiress. I didn't care enough to ask. I walked in and found my father alone, seated at the far end of a long polished table, reading a physical newspaper like it was 1975. He didn't look up when I entered. That wasn't unusual. "Morning," I said, keeping my voice even. He grunted softly, turning a page. There was already a cup of black coffee waiting at the other end of the table. My seat. I didn't ask if it was for me. My father was a man of quiet routines, and I was still his daughter, whether he liked admitting that out loud or not. I sat down. The silence between us stretched like it always had, like it was supposed to do all the heavy lifting that our conversations never did. "I saw the rehearsal," he said eventually, still not looking at me. "You didn't say much. Didn't feel like I needed to." He made a soft sound in the back of his throat, something between agreement and disapproval, the kind of noise he'd perfected over decades of fatherhood. I watched him fold the page. His hands were still strong, deliberate, a mason's grip dressed up in a lawyer's suit. He wore silence like a uniform. So did I. But mine had always come from knowing too much. His, I was starting to think, came from avoiding it. "I know how you are, Olivia," he said finally, still not looking up. "But this is Vanessa's moment. You know how important that is to your mother." "And to you?" He blinked slowly, still didn't answer. "What do you want from me, Dad?" I asked. "You want me to smile for the pictures, pretend I'm not noticing the way male stories don't add up, that nobody seems to know what his business actually is?" "I want you to keep it simple," he said, folding the newspaper carefully into fourths. "You don't have to start a war to prove your point." I leaned back in my chair. "I'm not starting anything." He looked at me then, really looked. There was something in his eyes I couldn't quite name. Worry? Guilt? Regret? maybe all of it. Some people, he said carefully, don't need a fight to feel attacked. They walk into a room already looking for one. And if they think you're the threat, whether you are or not, they'll make sure everyone else believes it too. I held his gaze. Is that what you think I am? A threat? He didn't answer. He never did when it mattered. But I saw it. The tension in his jaw, the way his hand curled around the coffee mug like he was bracing for something he didn't want to say. He wasn't warning me about Vanessa, or even Mail. He was warning me about himself, about the kind of silence he'd spent his whole life weaponizing, hiding behind it like a shield. He had always known more than he admitted. About the lies in our family, about what we swept under the rug when it was easier than confronting the truth, about how silence protected not innocence, but comfort. I won't make a scene, I said quietly. I didn't ask you not to, he replied. And that was the closest thing to permission I was ever going to get. I took one last sip of the coffee. It had gone cold. The brunch was held on the garden terrace of the estate. White umbrellas stretched overhead like oversized lilies, shielding guests from the late spring sun. There were mimosa stations, jazz musicians, and waiters who looked like they'd been trained not to blink. Everything was curated. Again, too perfect. Like a hotel brochure in human form. I sat at a table near the far edge of the patio, pretending to sip coffee while I watched. Vanessa fluttered between tables in a pale yellow dress, the exact shade that made her look innocent and camera-ready. Mikhail, or Mail, as everyone had agreed to call him now, stood beside her like a bodyguard in linen. Polite smile, sharp eyes. He didn't look like a groom. He looked like a man calculating exit strategies. I was studying the way he greeted the man beside him. Short nod, palm flat to shoulder, when something caught my eye. Mail turned slightly, laughing at something Vanessa said, and for a moment the collar of his shirt shifted. Hanging from a slender silver chain around his neck was what looked like a high-end pendant. Brushed metal, rectangular, clean edges, but the shape wasn't jewelry, not really. I leaned forward slightly, heart steady, eyes narrow. That wasn't a necklace, that was a disguised USB drive, and not just any kind. I knew the make. Military contractors used them during deep transfer intelligence work. High capacity, encrypted, thermal wipe enabled. You didn't buy one of those on Amazon. You received one in a locked case, signed and tracked. I'd seen one before. Kinnenrad, 5 years ago. The man wearing it back then was smuggling biometric data out of a compromised agency site. He didn't make it past customs. Now it was dangling from my future brother-in-law's neck like a charm. I sat back in my chair and reached for my coffee again. But my mind wasn't here anymore. It was in Kinnenrad, in Budapest, in a dark ops room in Frankfurt. Every place that name, Rostov, had ever popped up in intelligence briefings, every face that matched the voice I'd heard behind the hedge at the rehearsal dinner. Vanessa had no idea. She was pouring syrup onto a croissant and kissing his cheek like she'd won the lottery. I watched her touch his arm, lean in toward him, the same way she always had with men who had something she wanted. But I wasn't looking at her anymore. I was looking at him, and I was done giving him the benefit of the doubt. I stood, careful not to draw attention, and slipped back inside the house through the side hall. The signal in the garden had been weak, but the parlor had stronger reception. I opened my phone, decrypted the field relay app, and sent a message to my team. 3 words. Kinnenrad device confirmed. A few seconds later, the screen flashed. Message received. Standing by. I tucked the phone away, adjusted my jacket, and returned to the party. The sun was still shining, the jazz band was still playing, and the man with the USB drive was still smiling. But I had just started counting down. I stood in the shadow of the courtyard's archway, half hidden behind a pillar wrapped in wisteria. My hands were steady, folded in front of me, black dress blending into the marble and shade. I could hear the harpist playing something delicate, something that didn't match the pulse thrumming under my skin. Guests shuffled into their seats, murmuring about the weather and the wine. The usual pre-ceremony noise, nervous laughter, programs fluttering like paper fans. I could pick out the voices of diplomats, investors, a retired senator, a few names that had definitely appeared in intelligence reports I'd read in another life. I slipped my right hand to my ear, thumb grazing the small disc tucked deep in the canal. Alive, I whispered. A second of silence, then a reply, faint and crisp. Copy. Standing by. I let out a slow breath. The line was secure. The team was in place. Everything was where it needed to be, except me. I was exactly where I didn't want to be, watching my sister play bride to a man I knew wasn't who he claimed to be. The ceremony began with the usual orchestration. A voice over the speaker welcomed guests. The string quartet picked up where the harp left off. Male stood near the altar in a custom white suit, his tie a shade of ivory so precise it looked rehearsed. His father was seated in the front row, a man who wore sunglasses in the shade and whose handshake, I'd bet, came with a burner phone and a sealed envelope. Vanessa appeared at the top of the stone steps a moment later. The crowd stood. Cameras lifted. The perfect image locked into place. But I wasn't watching Vanessa. I was watching Male. His eyes didn't stay on her. They flicked, just once, to a man seated 3 rows back, then to his father, then to a younger man standing by the catering tent with an earpiece of his own. Not mine. He gave a nod. Small, brief. If you weren't looking, you'd miss it. But I saw it. And I knew what it meant. Signal sent. Message received. Everything about this wedding was a front, a disguise, a beautifully staged performance for something far uglier behind the curtain. Vanessa reached the altar. Her voice trembled as she read her vows. She looked like she was in love. I wondered if she'd still be smiling when she found out what she'd actually married into. I scanned the crowd again. The chopper hum was faint, far off still but getting closer, right on schedule. I pressed my hand to my stomach, not nerves, calibration, muscle memory. The sensation I'd learned to trust when seconds mattered more than months of planning. Final check, the voice in my ear said. Green across the board. I gave a single word. Ready. Vanessa took his hands. The officiant began the final portion of the ceremony, and I waited, the weight of the earpiece anchoring me. Justice wasn't a loud arrival. It was a breath held between syllables, and I was counting them one by one. The moment came without fanfare. 1 second, the officiant was guiding them through their vows, Vanessa glowing, Male calm and composed. And the next, a murmur rose from the back of the courtyard. It started as a ripple, then a shift. People turning their heads, confused. Then the sound of boots. I stayed still, hands clasped in front of me, heart steady. This wasn't adrenaline. This was clarity. The guests weren't sure what they were looking at. Most had never seen tactical teams up close, especially not in designer suits with discreet lapel pins and weapons hidden beneath tailored jackets. INTERPOL, Homeland, FBI. Every agency had taken a piece of this operation, and now they were all converging. The timing was perfect, better than rehearsed. Vanessa was the first to realize something was wrong. She turned as the lead agent stepped into the aisle, speaking into a shoulder mic. Subject is in visual, proceeding to extraction. Male's face shifted. Just a flicker, a glance toward his father, a half step back, then stillness. He didn't run. Smart. He knew it would only make it worse. Mr. Vasilyev, the agent said, voice calm but firm. You're under arrest. Please place your hands in front of you. The officiant froze mid-sentence. The guests were on their feet now, gasping, confused, some already filming with their phones. Someone dropped a glass. It shattered against the flagstone. Vanessa stared at her groom like he'd grown a second head. What is this? Male didn't answer. His father stood slowly in the front row, 2 agents flanking him before he could take a full step. One of them reached for his wrist, twisting it behind his back with clean, practiced efficiency. A third man, quiet, stocky, seated near the back, suddenly made a break for it, shoving past chairs. He didn't make it more than 10 feet before a pair of agents intercepted him. Guests screamed now. People stumbled over chairs. The quartet stopped playing mid-measure. A woman in a blue dress fainted. And still, I didn't move. Vanessa's eyes searched the crowd. Then they found me. I stood at the back of the aisle, not hiding. I wanted her to see me. Her lips parted. Her face drained of color. You, she mouthed. I didn't nod. I didn't blink. 2 more guests were pulled aside. One of them, the best man, apparently, was carrying a second phone that had already been wiped. Idiot. Within minutes, the courtyard had transformed from a celebration to a perimeter. Agents moved with quiet authority. The Vasilyevs were cuffed and separated. Protocol. I watched as Male was led away. He didn't resist, but he looked directly at me. Not with rage, not even hate, just acknowledgement. As if he'd always known this day would end like this. As if somehow I was inevitable. Vanessa didn't cry. She just stood there, bouquet clutched tight, the illusion bleeding out of her eyes. She looked at me again, and this time she said it aloud. You ruined everything. I didn't respond. I hadn't ruined anything. I had just ended the lie, and some lies need to be torn apart in front of everyone. It didn't take long for the internet to sink its teeth in. The first clip showed up within hours, shaky phone footage of male being led away in cuffs while guests screamed in the background. You could just barely see me standing near the edge of the aisle. Still, composed, silent. That was all it took. The headline wrote itself: Sister of the Bride exposes groom in FBI sting operation. By morning, I was viral. The stories came fast, mostly from people who had no clue what actually happened. Influencers who had been guests posted vague captions about being traumatized by betrayal. Twitter labeled me everything from a hero to a calculated attention seeker. A podcast I'd never heard of spent 40 minutes speculating whether I was jealous of my sister and had weaponized federal agencies to ruin her wedding. I didn't read most of it. I only know because someone in my old unit texted me, "You're trending." Bet that wasn't on the registry. What got under my skin wasn't the public backlash. I could take being misunderstood. It was the message from Vanessa. It came 2 days later. One sentence: "You always had to make it about you." I stared at the screen for a long time. I didn't respond, just hovered over the delete button, then pressed it. There was nothing to say to someone who thought doing the right thing was an act of vanity. I didn't expect to hear anything else. Vanessa had a talent for cutting people out while still making herself look like the wounded one. But 5 days later, a letter arrived. Actual paper. My name, written in her careful script, no return address. It was short, no apology, not really. Just a few lines that sounded like her voice when she wasn't being watched. She wrote that she didn't understand what Mail had done, that she wasn't ready to face it yet, that maybe someday she would. And then the last line: "You always knew what was underneath, and I didn't want to believe you. I still don't. But I can't say you were wrong." I folded the letter and tucked it into my desk drawer. I didn't need more than that. I wasn't chasing resolution. Outside the headlines, the real consequences began to surface. The charges were sealed, but whispers trickled through contacts I still had in DC. Fraud, laundering, foreign surveillance. Serious time. Vanessa disappeared from social media. So did most of the wedding guests. For a crowd that lived online, they all became very quiet. My phone stayed mostly silent. A few old friends reached out. My mother didn't. My father sent a text that just said, "You all right?" I didn't reply. It felt like a question 20 years too late. Every now and then I'd catch a glimpse of myself in the viral clips. The woman in black, unmoved while the world spun apart around her. They said I looked cold, that I looked like I didn't care. They were wrong. I cared deeply. I just didn't need to explain myself anymore. I planted basil on a Tuesday. The soil was warm, damp, and smelled like earth. Not blood, not gasoline, just earth. It had been 4 weeks since the wedding, maybe 5. I stopped counting after the third news cycle moved on. After the morning shows found a new scandal, a fresher headline, a newer villain to pick apart. The world forgot me the same way it found me. Quickly. Good. In the mornings, I sat out back with a cup of coffee and Miles Davis in my headphones. I read old paperbacks. I clipped rosemary. I learned to bake bread. I stopped checking my email altogether. My phone stayed on silent, shoved in a drawer. No notifications, no buzzes, no reminders that the world expected me to justify what I did, because I didn't owe anyone that anymore. A week into this new rhythm, I was walking through the farmer's market when someone approached me. Middle-aged, gray hoodie, kind eyes. I braced for confrontation, but he just said, "You're her, right? The sister?" I nodded once. He didn't ask for a selfie, didn't lecture me. He just said, "I watched that video." I don't know what really happened, but thank you. Someone had to see it. Then he walked away. That was it. 2 sentences. The only validation I ever needed. Back home, I sat at the kitchen table, unfolded the letter from Vanessa one more time. I'd read it maybe a dozen times since it arrived. It was short, no signature, just that one line that stayed with me. You always knew what was underneath. She hadn't called. I didn't expect her to. I didn't want a hug, or forgiveness, or to be invited to Thanksgiving. I didn't need any of that anymore. I tucked the letter back into its envelope and slid it into the drawer beside my passport, where I kept things that shaped me but no longer define me. Justice, I realized, rarely comes with applause. It doesn't ride in on flashing lights or deliver monologues from the witness stand. Sometimes it just arrives, quiet and sure, unshaken. I used to think my life was still tied to something, to the uniform I wore, the orders I followed, the family I kept circling back to, hoping they'd see me. But that wasn't my story anymore. I had spent years preparing for war, years training for worst-case scenarios, for betrayal, for ambush, for silence that cuts deeper than any weapon. And yet somehow it was peace I had to learn how to hold. The lavender in the garden was blooming again. I clipped a few sprigs, tied them with twine, and left them on my neighbor's porch. She was an old widow who'd never asked for anything, and that felt familiar. Later that night, I poured a glass of wine, opened the back door, and let the music spill into the dark. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked. A sprinkler clicked on. And in the space between it all, there was nothing pressing against my chest. No commands, no code names, no masks to wear. Just breathe. Just stillness. Just enough. The story wasn't over, but I had stopped fighting for a place in someone else's. This part, this was mine.